Welcome to this explainer. We are diving straight into one of the most fascinating and frankly highly charged dynamics in modern Australian politics right now. We're looking at the intense clash between the political establishment and the rapidly growing working class support for the One Nation Party. So you might be wondering, what exactly is driving everyday voters away from the traditional major parties? And how are veteran political insiders responding? Well, let's break the whole thing down impartially, looking at the hard data and the exact arguments coming from both sides. To really understand this phenomenon, we're going to follow a pretty straightforward agenda today. First, we'll look at the establishment critique, then the populist rebuttal, followed by the specific economic grievances, a look at the caravan park case study, and finally, we'll dive into the actual polling shift. Okay, kicking things off with Section 1, the establishment critique, and specifically Kelly's warning. So, veteran political commentator Paul Kelly absolutely does not mince words here. He argues forcefully that One Nation leader Pauline Hanson is, in his view, fundamentally unequipped for the top job. He warns that she would literally threaten every aspect of the country, from its economic prosperity right down to its social cohesion. It's a heavy critique. He points out she leads a party that has, quote, built nothing, shows zero capacity for executive power, and maintains some dubious ties. It's basically a sweeping, explicit warning against her having any kind of leadership role. But the juxtaposition here is just fascinating. When you put them side by side, look at how Hanson responds. When confronted with Kelly's severe assessment, she doesn't dive into a detailed point-by-point defense of her executive management skills. Not at all. Instead, she completely flips the script. She dismisses his structural critique entirely as just elitist paranoia. She argues that this exact dismissive attitude from commentators is the very thing driving everyday voters straight into the arms of One Nation. Which brings us to Section 2, the populist rebuttal, and Hanson's specific defense. Hanson counters this whole built nothing narrative by pointing directly to her own political resilience. I mean, after being out of parliament for 18 years, she rebuilt One Nation entirely from scratch. She also pushes back by asserting that her policies have historically forced the hands of the major parties. For example, claiming direct credit for pressuring former Prime Minister John Howard into adopting that controversial boat turn back policy. Today, she points to her team of elected members across both state and federal levels as hard proof of her true structural legitimacy. And this, right here, is a really core strategy in her defense, playing up that working-class credibility. Hanson deliberately places her own background right alongside past and present prime ministers. She points out that current PM Anthony Albanese frequently talks about growing up in a housing commission, and historically, Prime Minister Ben Chifley was a train driver. By comparing those paths directly to her own background of running a small fish and chip shop, her takeaway is crystal clear. Anyone can and should aspire to lead. She is totally rejecting the idea that you need a specialized political elite to run the country. Let's move on to Section 3, grievances and the economy. How the major parties are supposedly failing the people. So what is actually driving all this momentum? Well, Hanson rapidly targets a really wide array of structural issues, basically arguing that the major parties have fundamentally failed the public. She draws a direct line between mass migration and current housing shortages. She points to the voice to Parliament as a major source of division, and she links climate change policies straight to escalating power prices. Add to that mix some serious economic instability. We're talking 50,000 insolvent small businesses, lost manufacturing, and 147,000 millionaires leaving the country because, according to her, there's just a lack of investment incentives. But perhaps the most jarring metric she brings to the table is this one, 7 million. She points out that 7 million Australians can currently only afford one meal a day. Just let the scale of that sink in for a second. That's a huge portion of the population. She uses this stark figure to really highlight the absolute severity of the cost of living crisis, arguing that it's undeniable proof that national prosperity has just fractured under the major parties. Now, let's zoom in a bit for Section 4, the caravan park case, a true grassroots story. To see how this broad platform actually translates on the ground, consider this specific anecdote from her Queensland tour. Hanson recounts wrapping up a grueling 16-hour campaign day, only to be called to visit a destitute widow. This woman had actually fallen behind on her rent just to pay for her husband's funeral, and she was facing imminent eviction from a caravan. Hanson explicitly uses tragic local stories exactly like this to contrast the daily, real-world struggles of ordinary citizens with what she calls the protected bubbles of the political elite. $360. That is the weekly rent this widowed woman was paying for a caravan with absolutely no amenities. Hanson hammers home this exact number to argue that everyday vulnerable people are being systematically ripped off, while establishment politicians remain totally clueless to the reality on the ground. Through stories like this, she's positioning herself as the only real voice for the marginalized. Okay, so we've seen the establishment critique, and we've heard the emotionally charged rebuttal. But here is the absolutely crucial question. Is all this grassroots rhetoric actually shifting the broader political landscape? Are voters really changing their minds? Or is this all just campaign noise? Let's look at the numbers. And that brings us perfectly to Section 5, the polling shift, voter realignment. Stepping away from the rhetoric for a minute, the objective data from the latest Sky News Pulse poll reveals a really significant realignment. One Nation has surged to 29% support among working-class Australians. That's a solid 4-point increase. And the real kicker? In doing so, they've actually overtaken the Labour Party in this demographic, with Labour falling behind at 26%. That single data point represents a massive, massive fracture in traditional voting bases. And this shifting landscape isn't just a headache for Labour either. On the other side of the aisle, a massive 44% of coalition voters are now openly willing to see their party team up with One Nation to form a government. Think about that for a second. Nearly half of the Conservative base is signaling that they no longer view One Nation as just some fringe protest vote. They see them as a completely viable, legitimate governing partner. And we're seeing this statistical trend vividly backed up on the ground. Hanson shared this striking story about a 96-year-old voter in the wealthy district of Nepean who approached her to say exactly this. After a literal lifetime of voting Labour, he is abandoning his traditional loyalty to vote for One Nation. When you have voters who are nearly a century old, shifting their deeply entrenched political habits in search of economic relief, it really shows just how deeply this messaging is resonating out there. As we wrap up this explainer, we are definitely looking at a drastically changing political map. On one hand, the establishment is warning of existential threats to national cohesion. But on the other hand, populist forces are clearly harnessing genuine economic pain to completely upend historical voting patterns. So we really have to ask ourselves, is this working-class surge toward One Nation merely a temporary protest against tough times, or are we witnessing a permanent, irreversible fracture of the traditional two-party system? It's a question that is undoubtedly going to define the next era of Australian politics. Thanks for joining me, and keep questioning the data.